Picture this. You are feeling the intense vibrations of the super battleship Yamato's massive engines tearing through the Pacific Ocean in April 1942. The Japanese Empire is aggressively expanding, violently crushing every Allied fleet in its path. Sailors on the upper decks are loudly celebrating an unbroken streak of bloody lightning-fast victories. Down in his steel-walled private cabin, Admiral Yamamoto is doing the exact opposite. He's hastily writing a cynical, fatalistic letter to his mistress, a geisha named Chiyoko Kawai. He knows the brutal truth driving the Empire's terrifying blitzkrieg. He calculates that Japan has exactly 12 months before American steel factories wipe his entire navy off the map. This forbidden, highly classified correspondence exposes a commander paralysed by the economic doom speeding toward his nation. Why does a brilliant tactician, armed with the exact mathematical certainty of his own destruction, order his invincible fleet to sail directly into the fatal trap of the Battle of Midway? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this, and please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The spring of 1942 demanded immediate, desperate action from the Allied forces. You must drop yourself right into the chaos of that exact moment, stripping away the comfort of knowing the final outcome. The United States Pacific Fleet was hemorrhaging ships and men. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had left battleships burning in the mud, thousands of sailors dead, and the American public demanding retaliation. Across the ocean, the Japanese military machine seized territory with terrifying speed. They invaded Malaya, conquered Singapore, overran the Philippines and captured the Dutch East Indies. They locked down a maritime empire of unimaginable scale to secure the massive oil reserves and rubber plantations they desperately needed to feed their war machine. Wars are won on factory floors and in accounting ledgers long before the first shot is fired. Admiral Yamamoto grasped war economics with lethal clarity. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had personally walked past the sprawling oil refineries of Texas and the massive automotive assembly lines in Detroit. He understood the horrifying math of industrial warfare. Look directly at the raw numbers. In 1942, the United States was producing roughly 70 million tons of steel annually. The Japanese Empire, violently extracting resources from its newly conquered territories, struggled to produce 6 million tons. To put that industrial disparity into a modern context, imagine a local hardware startup trying to out-manufacture the entire global supply chain of Apple, Amazon, and Tesla combined. The United States possessed an industrial capacity so vast that the government ordered the immediate shutdown of the civilian automotive sector. Detroit factory workers stopped assembling passenger cars on a Friday and began welding heavy bombers and tank treads on a Monday. Yamamoto knew that if the United States fully mobilized this economic juggernaut, Japan would face absolute annihilation under a tidal wave of ships, planes, and high explosive ammunition. If Japan lost a single aircraft carrier, shipyards in Yokosuka would need 3 years to replace it. If the United States lost one, shipyards in Brooklyn and Newport News were already laying the steel keels for 10 more. This terrifying economic countdown dictated every aggressive move Yamamoto made. He needed a decisive, crushing victory to break the American fighting spirit before those Detroit factories could fully spool up. He had to force the United States government to the negotiating table to secure a favourable peace treaty. The clock was his deadliest enemy. His strike plan targeted a tiny, seemingly insignificant speck of coral in the vast Pacific Ocean. Midway Atoll consists of 2 small islands, Sand and Eastern, totaling barely 2 square miles of flat sand. It sits roughly 1,300 miles northwest of Honolulu. In modern terms, that is the exact distance between New York City and Miami, consisting of absolutely nothing but deep hostile ocean. Midway served as the outermost sentry guarding the Hawaiian Islands. Yamamoto theorized that Admiral Chester Nimitz, the newly appointed commander of the US Pacific Fleet, would never allow Midway to fall without a fight. Threatening this lonely outpost would force Nimitz to push his few remaining aircraft carriers into open water. Yamamoto designed Operation MY to execute the ultimate ambush. He assembled the Kido Butai, the elite 1st Air Fleet, the very same lethal strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor. This armada included 4 heavy aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. They carried the most experienced, battle-hardened naval aviators on the planet. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter plane engineered to completely outmaneuver and destroy any American aircraft of that time. Deploying this massive fleet triggered a logistical nightmare. Moving dozens of heavy warships across thousands of miles of open ocean requires astronomical volumes of fuel. The Japanese Imperial Navy's logistics records from the Senshi Sosho reveal they had to commit a massive percentage of their strictly rationed national oil reserves just to push the fleet to the Central Pacific and back. They relied on a fragile, vulnerable chain of slow-moving oil tankers to refuel the warships at sea. Pumping heavy bunker fuel through rubber hoses between moving ships in rolling ocean swells was incredibly dangerous. Supplying tons of rice, fresh water, and high-explosive ammunition to thousands of sailors, far from any friendly port, stretched their supply lines to the absolute breaking point. They were pulling a rubber band to its maximum tension, praying it would not snap before the combat phase began. Back at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz faced a brutal tactical equation. Nimitz had taken command in December 1941, inheriting a shattered fleet and a deeply traumatized navy. His personal command diary, famously known as the Grey Book, records the daily, agonizing pressure of calculating his survival odds. He possessed exactly 3 operational aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The catastrophic condition of the USS Yorktown perfectly illustrates the desperate improvisational state of the American military. She had just survived the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. Japanese armour-piercing bombs had ripped straight through her wooden flight deck, exploding deep inside the hull, causing severe structural damage and raging internal fires. When Yorktown limped into the dry dock at Pearl Harbor, dragging a massive oil slick behind her, top naval engineers inspected the warped bulkheads. They handed Nimitz an official estimate requiring 3 months of intensive repair to make her battle-ready. Nimitz walked the damaged deck, stared at the mangled steel, looked at his engineers, and gave them exactly 3 days. The physical labour required to execute that order defies belief. Over 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed the smoking vessel. They worked continuous 24-hour shifts in suffocating 120-degree heat, down in the ship's bowels. They cut away twisted metal with acetylene torches, hauled massive steel plates by hand, and rewired complex electrical grids. They completely bypassed standard naval safety protocols, patching the enormous warship together with brute force, continuous welding arcs, and pure adrenaline. The civilian power grid of Honolulu experienced massive rolling blackouts because the dry dock pumps and welding machines were pulling so much electricity. The Yorktown sailed out of Pearl Harbor, essentially still under active construction. Hundreds of civilian contractors remained trapped on board, desperately fixing the hydraulic machinery and flight deck elevators as the ship charged headlong toward a combat zone. Nimitz chose to execute a massive, highly calculated risk. He knew his fleet was vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and outexperienced. He understood the fragile nature of his own supply lines and the absolute strategic necessity of preserving his few remaining carriers. He rejected the safe option of retreating to the US West Coast. He decided to send Enterprise, Hornet, Gian, and the battered Yorktown to a specific grid coordinate north of Midway, waiting in absolute radio silence to ambush the Japanese ambushers. The Pacific Ocean is so incomprehensibly large that locating a moving enemy fleet requires massive luck or perfect intelligence. The Japanese commanders operated under the strict fatal assumption that the American carriers were either undergoing lengthy repairs in Pearl Harbor or operating thousands of miles away in the South Pacific. They sailed toward Midway wrapped in a heavy blanket of supreme confidence, trusting their overwhelming firepower and the sheer psychological momentum of their previous victories. They failed to account for a silent, invisible war currently raging thousands of miles away from the ocean waves. while the massive steel ships violently crashed through the Pacific swells, a small group of exhausted, highly eccentric men working in a damp, windowless basement in Hawaii were actively dismantling the Japanese Empire's greatest strategic advantage. The impending physical slaughter would be executed with heavy dive bombers and steel torpedoes, but the absolute foundation of the American victory was currently being built on intercepted radio waves, shattered mathematical codes, and a brilliant psychological deception involving a fake water shortage. The stage was set for a violent collision that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of human history, driven by economic panic, massive logistical gambles, and a quiet war of mathematics. Imagine trying to physically move a medium-sized industrial city across the Pacific Ocean using nothing but 1940s technology. You cannot just pack up the buildings. You have to bring the power plants, the grocery stores, the hospitals, and enough fuel to keep every single machine running continuously for weeks. That is the exact challenge Admiral Yamamoto faced when he ordered the execution of Operation MI. We frequently marvel at the sheer destructive power of warships firing heavy cannons or launching squadrons of dive bombers. The true dictating force of naval warfare, however, is the invisible, exhausting, and incredibly fragile chain of supply that gets those ships to the battlefield in the first place. To understand the fatal flaw in the Japanese strategy, you have to look past the intimidating steel armour and examine the accounting books. According to the detailed maritime records preserved in the Senshi Sosho, the official military history of Japan, assembling this armada required a terrifying financial and logistical commitment. Japan went to war in 1941 specifically because the United States had cut off their oil supply. They conquered the Dutch East Indies to secure new oil wells, but extracting, refining, and transporting that crude oil back to the home islands was a slow, agonizing process. By committing the Kido Butai and its massive support fleet to the Midway operation, the Imperial Japanese Navy was actively burning through a massive percentage of their strategic national petroleum reserves. Yeah, they were betting the economic survival of their entire empire on a single roll of the dice. The fleet departing from the Hashirajima anchorage was a mechanical leviathan. It included 4 heavy aircraft carriers, powerful battleships, heavy cruisers, and a swarm of smaller, agile destroyers. The distance from their home waters to Midway Atoll is roughly 2,500 miles. That translates to driving a convoy of heavy trucks from Los Angeles to New York City. Now add a crucial layer of extreme difficulty to that modern comparison. You must make this cross-country drive without ever stopping at a gas station, and you can only refuel your trucks while they are moving at 20 miles per hour on a violently shaking, unpredictable highway. This brings us to the most dangerous and physically demanding operation in any navy: underway replenishment. The massive battleships and carriers carried enough heavy bunker fuel to make the round trip. The smaller destroyers, absolutely essential for protecting the carriers from American submarines, had tiny fuel tanks. They burned through their reserves rapidly and required continuous refueling at sea. Japanese fleet logistics depended heavily on a vulnerable procession of slow, unarmoured oil tankers trailing behind the main combat ships. Put yourself on the slippery, oil-stained steel deck of a Japanese destroyer in the middle of the Pacific swell. To refuel, your ship has to pull up alongside a massive tanker. The 2 captains must perfectly match their speed and course, separated by perhaps 100 feet of churning, deadly water. One miscalculation, one sudden rogue wave, and the 2 steel hulls will violently collide. While the ships grind forward, exhausted sailors must manually heave thick, incredibly heavy rubber hoses across the gap. They secure these lines by hand, pumping highly flammable heavy oil under immense pressure. The crew performs this terrifying mechanical ballet in total radio silence, constantly scanning the horizon for enemy periscopes. A single torpedo hitting the tanker during this process would instantly incinerate both vessels. This exhausting procedure dictated the speed and the rigid timetable of Yamamoto's entire operation. Yamamoto compounded this immense logistical strain with a deeply flawed strategic design. If you analyse his battle plan through the lens of modern game theory, You immediately spot a catastrophic error in risk management. Yamamoto possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. He had enough ships to simply surround Midway, absorb any American counterattack, and crush Admiral Nimitz through sheer brute force. Instead of concentrating his massive power into one unbreakable fist, Yamamoto divided his armada into 4 widely separated flotillas. He sent a completely separate strike force thousands of miles to the north to attack the Aleutian Islands near Alaska. He held his powerful main body of battleships hundreds of miles behind the aircraft carriers. He placed the troop transports carrying the invasion force in another distinct group. He designed this incredibly complex web of movement to confuse the Americans, hoping Nimitz would chase the diversion in Alaska or become paralyzed by the multiple threats. This elaborate plan violated a fundamental rule of military strategy: never divide your forces in the face of an enemy whose exact location is unknown. By scattering his ships across millions of square miles of ocean, Yamamoto stripped away his own numerical advantage. The groups were sailing too far apart to physically support each other. If the carrier strike force encountered sudden, overwhelming trouble, Yamamoto's heavily armed battleships were sailing 2 days behind them, completely useless in a fast-paced aerial firefight. He created a massive distance trap for his own men. The Japanese commanders were operating under the psychological burden of a strict, inflexible timetable. The invasion force had to land on Midway on a specific date. The carriers had to be in a precise grid coordinate to provide air cover. When logistics dictate tactics, commanders lose their flexibility. The Japanese sailors deeply felt this rigid pressure. Down in the sweltering, unventilated boiler rooms, the temperature routinely exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Fresh water was strictly rationed. The men survived on meagre portions of white rice, dried fish, and pickled vegetables, sweating out vital minerals as they furiously shoveled coal or monitored high-pressure steam valves. Fatigue became a physical poison spreading through the fleet. They endured this brutal physical punishment because their officers assured them of absolute victory. The Japanese High Command believed their operational security was flawless. They assumed Admiral Nimitz was completely blind, sitting in Pearl Harbor, desperately trying to guess where the Empire would strike next. They believed they held the element of total surprise, sailing under a cloak of perfect secrecy toward a defenseless target. They were catastrophically wrong. The invisible shield they relied upon had already been shattered. While the Japanese sailors wrestled with heavy fuel hoses and stared out at the empty, endless ocean, their most closely guarded military secrets were being actively dissected on a daily basis. The true battlefield was not the rolling waves of the Central Pacific. The battle for Midway had already begun weeks earlier, fought with pencils, punch cards and typewriters in a heavily guarded, heavily caffeinated basement, located thousands of miles away. The Japanese fleet was not sailing toward a glorious ambush. They were blindly marching directly into a mathematically calculated execution. Step away from the blinding sun and the violent rolling waves of the open Pacific. Descend into a damp, windowless basement beneath the 14th Naval District Administration building at Pearl Harbor. You're entering a highly secure, restricted dungeon colloquially known as the Dungeon, officially designated as Codebreaking Station Hypo. The air inside this concrete bunker is entirely distinct from the fresh ocean breeze outside. It smells sharply of stale coffee, burning tobacco, ozone from overheating electrical machinery, and the unwashed sweat of men pushed to the absolute brink of human endurance. The physical environment was deliberately harsh. The Navy had installed primitive, massive air conditioning units down here. They did not install them for the comfort of the personnel. They installed them to keep the massive IBM punch card tabulating machines from catching fire due to constant friction and overheating. The ambient temperature hovered near freezing. The noise was deafening, a relentless mechanical clattering of heavy metal keys punching rectangular holes into thousands of thick paper cards. Commanding this subterranean war room was Commander Joseph Rochefort. He was an eccentric, brilliant, and deeply unconventional naval officer. He had spent 3 years in Japan studying their language, culture, and military mindset. Down in the dungeon, military uniform regulations completely ceased to exist. Rochefort famously patrolled the noisy rows of desks wearing a red velvet smoking jacket over his khaki uniform and a pair of worn-out carpet slippers. He wore the jacket to fight off the biting chill of the air conditioners. He wore the slippers because his feet were swollen from pacing the concrete floor for 20 hours a day. He and his team of linguists, mathematicians, and eccentric musicians were fighting a war of pure attrition against the Japanese Imperial Navy's most sophisticated communication system. The Japanese military relied on a highly complex cryptographic system designated by the Americans as JN-25. You must understand the sheer mathematical brutality of this code to appreciate what Station Hypo accomplished. The Japanese communicators used a massive codebook containing tens of thousands of words and phrases. See, each word was assigned a specific 5-digit number. If a Japanese radio operator wanted to transmit the word battleship, he looked up the corresponding 5-digit code. That was only the first layer of security. The operator then opened a second, completely separate book, filled with pages of random mathematically generated 5-digit numbers, known as an additive book. He added a string of these random numbers to his original code message using non-carrying arithmetic. He then transmitted the final, completely scrambled result over the radio waves in Morse code. To the American intercept stations listening across the Pacific, these broadcasts sounded like pure, meaningless static. Breaking JNN-25 in 1942 without access to the physical codebooks was equivalent to trying to guess a massive, however randomly generated alphanumeric password for a modern banking system, using nothing but a pencil and scratch paper. The men in Station Hypo had to capture thousands of intercepted messages, punch them onto IBM cards, and run them through the sorting machines over and over again. They were desperately hunting for tiny, repetitive mathematical anomalies. They were looking for structural flaws in the random number tables. Slowly, agonizingly, they began stripping away the false numbers to reveal the underlying 5-digit codes. By May 1942, Rochefort's exhausted team had successfully cracked roughly 15% of the current JN-25 vocabulary. They were essentially reading a highly technical book where 85% of the words were completely blacked out. They relied heavily on contextual clues, traffic analysis, and a deep psychological understanding of how Japanese naval commanders communicated. Declassified daily decryption reports from Station Hypo show a sudden, massive spike in Japanese radio traffic, originating from Admiral Yamamoto's flagship and the major naval bases in the home islands. The decrypted fragments contained a chilling, repeating 2-letter designator, Target AF. The Japanese dispatchers were organising a colossal invasion force directed at this specific location. The intercept data indicated a massive mobilisation of aircraft carriers, troop transports, and heavy cruisers. A fierce, high-stakes intellectual battle immediately erupted between the codebreakers in Hawaii and the top brass in Washington, D.C. The Central Intelligence Command, known as OP-20G, confidently assessed that Target AF represented the Aleutian Islands near Alaska, or perhaps Port Moresby in the South Pacific, or even a direct assault on the west coast of the United States. They analysed the data through a traditional conservative military lens. They believed the Japanese would target major land masses to secure significant territorial gains. Rochefort vehemently disagreed. He analysed the intercepted routing slips and the specific units being mobilised. He looked at the fuel calculations and the required air cover mentioned in the broken fragments. He deduced that Target AF had to be Midway Atoll. The problem was entirely evidentiary. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, was caught in the middle of this fierce bureaucratic dispute. Nimitz desperately needed absolute, undeniable proof before he would commit his 3 surviving heavily damaged aircraft carriers to a single coordinate in the open ocean. If he guessed wrong and sent his ships to Midway while the Japanese attacked Hawaii or the West Coast, the United States Navy would lose the Pacific War entirely. He could not gamble the fate of the free world on Rochefort's intuition. The solution to this paralysing dilemma came from Commander Jasper Holmes, a key member of the Station Hypo team. He proposed a brilliant application of basic game theory and psychological manipulation. He suggested setting a highly specific, verifiable trap for the Japanese listening posts. Midway Atoll relies entirely on massive mechanical desalination plants to convert seawater into drinkable fresh water for the garrison. Holmes instructed the base commander on Midway to transmit an urgent, unencrypted emergency message over a known, easily intercepted radio frequency. The message simply stated that the island's primary water distillation plant had suffered a catastrophic failure and the base was experiencing a severe shortage of fresh water. Nimitz approved the ruse. The fake distress call blasted out across the Pacific on an open channel. Down in the freezing dungeon of Station Hypo, the exhausted codebreakers stopped everything and waited. The psychological tension in that basement was absolute. If the Japanese ignored the transmission, the theory would collapse. If they intercepted it, but recognized it as a trap, they would change all their codes immediately, blinding the American Navy permanently. 2 days passed in agonizing silence. The IBM machines continued their deafening clatter. The coffee pots burned dry. The men stared at the incoming teletype feeds from the intercept stations. On May 14th, a Japanese listening post located on Kwajalein Atoll picked up the fake emergency transmission. The Japanese intelligence officers completely fell for the deception. They immediately formulated a highly classified report to alert the approaching invasion fleet about the logistical issue. They encrypted their message using the JN-25 system and broadcast it back across the Pacific to their naval high command. American intercept stations captured the transmission and immediately fed the encrypted text down to the basement in Pearl Harbor. Rochefort's cryptanalysts attacked the message. They quickly stripped away the additive numbers. They isolated the underlying 5-digit code groups. The translation was precise, undeniable, and utterly explosive. The Japanese message clearly stated that Target AF was running desperately short of fresh water. The message highly recommended that the invasion force bring massive reserve water boilers to support the landing troops. The mathematical proof was absolute. The elaborate Japanese cloak of operational secrecy instantly disintegrated into thin air. Target AF was Midway. Rochefort delivered this decoded message directly to Admiral Nimitz. This single piece of paper fundamentally altered the power dynamic of the impending battle. Yamamoto believed he was orchestrating a massive invisible ambush against a blind and crippled enemy. Instead, Nimitz now possessed the ultimate tactical advantage. He knew the exact identity of the target. He knew the precise composition of the enemy fleet. Most importantly, the intercepted radio traffic provided the specific date of the planned attack, early June. The Japanese Empire was still building heavy warships, refining crude oil, and celebrating their inevitable victory. They had no idea that their entire intricate fuel-hungry operation had just been mathematically compromised by a handful of sleep-deprived men wearing bathrobes in a freezing basement. Nimitz immediately began formulating a ruthless counter-ambush, moving his tiny, battered fleet out of Pearl Harbor under absolute radio silence, sailing toward a specific coordinate north of Midway Atoll, known only as Point Luck. War at the highest strategic level rarely resembles the chaotic, adrenaline-fueled combat experienced by the soldiers on the front lines. War at the level of a fleet admiral is an isolated, deeply psychological exercise in managing incomplete information. You are essentially playing a high-stakes game of blind chess across a board that spans millions of square miles of deadly ocean. By late May 1942, the pieces were in motion. The massive Japanese armada sailed eastward, completely unaware that their operational blueprint rested on an American desk. Admiral Chester Nimitz sat in his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, staring at that exact blueprint, holding the ultimate intelligence advantage. Possessing the enemy's playbook does not guarantee victory if your own team is battered, and outnumbered, and physically exhausted. Nimitz now faced the terrifying responsibility of translating intercepted mathematics into physical fleet movements. Let us examine the stark contrast in command philosophy between the two opposing leaders. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto commanded his massive operation from the bridge of the super battleship Yamato. This vessel was an unparalleled marvel of naval engineering, displacing over 70,000 tons of steel and armed with monstrous 18-inch guns. Deep inside its armoured citadel, the Yamato housed the most powerful and sophisticated radio communication equipment in the entire Japanese fleet. Yamamoto had the technological capacity to monitor the entire Pacific theatre. He made a fatal, crippling decision based on outdated naval doctrine, was he imposed absolute radio silence on his entire fleet. Yamamoto believed he had to hide his battleships from American submarines at all costs. He positioned his main battleship force roughly 300 miles behind his leading aircraft carriers, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Yamamoto's powerful radio receivers on the Yamato intercepted alarming transmissions from Tokyo, indicating that American submarines and reconnaissance planes were highly active near Midway. Yamamoto possessed critical real-time intelligence that the American forces were actively preparing an ambush. He refused to break radio silence to warn Nagumo. He strictly assumed that Nagumo's carriers, sailing far ahead, were also receiving these same broadcasts. They were not. The aircraft carriers possessed significantly smaller, weaker radio antennas. Furthermore, the heavy atmospheric interference and the physical distance completely blocked Tokyo's warning signals from reaching Nagumo's radio operators. Yamamoto sat in the dark, possessing vital data, while his frontline strike force sailed completely blind. To put this command failure into a modern context, imagine a massive global corporation launching a hostile takeover. The chief executive officer has a fibre optic internet connection and sees the stock market violently crashing. He refuses to pick up the phone to warn his frontline stockbrokers because corporate policy strictly forbids using communication devices during a major transaction. The Japanese communication architecture was fundamentally broken by their own rigidly enforced rules. Admiral Chester Nimitz operated under a completely different psychological framework. He remained physically anchored at his headquarters in Hawaii. He knew he could not micromanage a fast-paced naval battle taking place 1,300 miles away. He had to delegate absolute tactical authority to his frontline commanders. Nimitz drafted a highly specific, legally binding combat directive designated as Pacific Fleet Operation Plan 2942. Naval historians consider this document a masterpiece of strategic clarity. Deep within this operational plan, Nimitz embedded a specific paragraph that completely defined the American approach to the impending violence. He issued the doctrine of the calculated risk. Nimitz explicitly ordered his task force commanders that they were to engage the Japanese fleet only if they could inflict more damage than they were likely to receive. He gave them explicit permission to retreat. Analyze this order through the lens of pure game theory and war economics. Nimitz was essentially issuing a strict financial stop-loss order to his commanders. He understood the brutal mathematics of the American industrial timeline. The United States possessed exactly 3 operational aircraft carriers in the Pacific. If Nimitz lost them, the entire west coast of the United States would be completely defenseless for at least a year. He told his commanders to brutally weigh the economic value of destroying a Japanese carrier against the catastrophic cost of losing an American one. If the tactical math turned against them at any moment, they were ordered to abandon Midway Atoll and save the ships. The island of Midway was made of sand and coral. It could be recaptured later. The aircraft carriers were made of irreplaceable steel and highly trained human capital. They had to survive. Execution of this mathematically ruthless strategy required a commander devoid of ego and prone to cold analytical calculation. Nimitz's most aggressive and experienced carrier commander, Admiral William Bull Halsey, was hospitalized with a severe debilitating case of shingles. Halsey literally could not put on his uniform without weeping from the pain. Nimitz needed a replacement immediately. He bypassed several senior naval aviators and selected Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. This appointment shocked the naval establishment. Spruance was a surface ship commander. He commanded heavy cruisers. He had never flown an airplane and had zero experience directing complex carrier flight operations. Nimitz selected Spruance precisely because of his psychological profile. Spruance was quiet, fiercely intelligent, and entirely immune to panic. He possessed a mechanical, deeply analytical mind that perfectly aligned with the doctrine of calculated risk. Spruance would not charge blindly into a firefight for personal glory. He would analyse the board, wait for the mathematical advantage, and strike with lethal precision. Nimitz ordered Spruance and rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher to take the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily patched Yorktown to a specific grid coordinate on the map. This patch of empty ocean was located roughly 300 miles northeast of Midway. The United States Navy designated this coordinate as Point Luck. The physical journey to Point Luck tested the psychological endurance of every American sailor involved. The three carriers, escorted by a screen of cruisers and destroyers, slipped out of Pearl Harbor and vanished into the vast expanse of the Pacific. They sailed under the strictest form of emission control. Every radio transmitter was physically disabled. The radar systems were severely restricted. The men lived in a state of sensory deprivation, surrounded by nothing but grey water and heavy cloud cover. Arriving at Point Luck on June 2nd, the American task forces entered a holding pattern. They were floating silently in a massive fog bank, waiting for a colossal enemy fleet they could not see. The tension aboard the ships became a physical weight pressing down on the crews. Down in the sweltering engine rooms, just mechanics obsessively checked oil pressures and steam valves, knowing that a single mechanical failure during combat meant certain death. Up on the wooden flight decks, young aviators sat in the cramped cockpits of their Dauntless dive bombers and Devastator torpedo planes. They repeatedly checked their gauges, oiled their machine guns, and stared out into the dense fog. Many of these pilots were barely out of flight school. They were fully aware that they were about to fly obsolete aircraft against the most experienced, battle-hardened fighter pilots on Earth. The battle lines were now irreversibly drawn, defined by a massive asymmetry in information and command structure. Admiral Yamamoto sailed forward with overwhelming firepower, paralysed by his own rigid communication blackouts and absolute arrogance. Admiral Nimitz stayed behind. She's armed with perfect intelligence, relying on the cold, calculating restraint of Raymond Spruance to execute an economic ambush. The silent waiting ended abruptly in the early dawn hours of June 4th. The mathematical theories and the intercepted radio waves were about to instantly transform into tearing metal, burning aviation fuel, and an unprecedented slaughter in the skies above the Pacific. In the absolute silence of the Central Pacific shattered at exactly 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the compass bridge of the Akagi, watching his massive fleet execute a highly complex synchronized turn into the wind. This maneuver was a strict physical requirement for launching heavy combat aircraft from a short wooden deck. The primary Midway aircraft carriers under his command, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu and Soryu, began rapidly disgorging their lethal cargo into the pre-dawn darkness. Within 15 minutes, 108 Japanese warplanes were circling above the fleet, forming a massive, heavily armed V formation. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga took the lead, pointing his Nakajima B-5N bomber directly toward the tiny coral atoll located 240 miles to the southeast. Sending an air armada of this size required staggering logistical consumption. Launching 108 high-performance aircraft burned through thousands of gallons of highly refined aviation fuel in mere minutes. The Japanese mechanics on the flight decks worked furiously in the dark, hand-cranking inertial starters and physically pushing heavy airplanes into position. And every single movement was calculated, rehearsed and executed with lethal efficiency. The Kido Butai was operating at the absolute peak of its mechanical capability, hurling a highly concentrated wave of explosive power toward an enemy they believed was entirely blind. The American defenders were actively watching them come. Admiral Nimitz's intelligence triumph had bought the island garrison the most precious commodity in warfare: time. The United States Navy had deployed a fleet of PBY Catalina flying boats from the Atoll days earlier. These massive, slow-moving amphibious planes flew exhausting 14-hour search patterns across the empty ocean. The pilots navigated using rudimentary celestial mathematics, staring at the endless grey water until their eyes burned. At 5:30, a young pilot named Lieutenant Howard Ady broke through a low cloud bank and spotted the wakes of the Japanese ships tearing through the ocean surface. He immediately keyed his radio and broadcasted a terse, unencrypted message back to the island. He reported enemy carriers. Minutes later, another PBY pilot spotted the incoming massive swarm of aircraft. Midway Atoll instantly transformed from a quiet outpost into a frantic hive of mechanical preparation. The air raid sirens wailed across the flat sand. Ground crews scrambled to fuel and arm the defending fighter squadrons. The United States Marine Corps stationed on the island belonged to Marine Fighting Squadron 221. These men were brave, highly motivated, and tragically doomed by their own nation's sluggish industrial transition. You must understand the brutal economics of military aviation in early 1942 to grasp the tragedy of the impending aerial collision. The Marine pilots sprinted toward their aircraft, primarily consisting of the Brewster F-2A Buffalo. The Buffalo was an obsolete, aggressively flawed piece of engineering. It was heavily armoured, burdened with bulky, self-sealing fuel tanks, and drastically underpowered. The pilots sarcastically referred to it as the Flying Peanut. The United States military-industrial complex was still ramping up production of superior fighter planes, forcing these frontline Marines to defend their lives using leftover, outdated hardware. Flying against them was the Mitsubishi A6M0. The Japanese aeronautical engineers had designed the Zero using a completely different economic philosophy. They demanded extreme range and unmatched agility. To achieve this, they stripped away heavy armour plating and removed the self-sealing fuel tanks. They sacrificed the pilot's survivability for pure aerodynamic performance. Racing a Buffalo against a Zero in a dogfight was mathematically equivalent to entering a heavy armoured delivery van into a Formula One race against a lightweight, precision-tuned sports car. The laws of physics heavily dictated the outcome before the first trigger was pulled. At 6:16, the Marine radar on Midway picked up the incoming Japanese swarm at a distance of 93 miles. 25 Marine fighters climbed desperately into the morning sky to intercept them. Major Floyd Parks led his squadron of obsolete Buffaloes directly into the massive Japanese formation. The ensuing engagement was a rapid, mechanical slaughter. The American pilots attempted to dive on the Japanese bombers, but the escorting Zeros reacted with terrifying speed. The lightweight Japanese fighters effortlessly outclimbed the heavy American planes, looping around them and unleashing devastating bursts of 20mm cannon fire. The unarmoured Zeros were fragile, but the Buffaloes simply could not manoeuvre fast enough to hit them. The American planes were shredded in mid-air, cockpits filled with smoke and shattered glass. The heavy armour plating of the Buffalo failed to stop the large-caliber explosive rounds. Within minutes, the Japanese Zeros systematically destroyed the American defence. The official after-action reports filed by the Marine Corps provide a chilling, unfiltered assessment of this technological disparity. Captain Philip R. White, one of the few surviving pilots, wrote a blistering evaluation of his equipment. He stated directly on the official record that any commander who ordered a pilot into combat flying a Brewster Buffalo should consider that pilot dead before the aircraft even left the ground. The American military learned the catastrophic cost of fielding obsolete technology through the blood of its own aviators. Out of the 25 Marine fighters that launched that morning, only 10 managed to return to the island, and most of those were so heavily damaged they never flew again. With the American fighter screen completely annihilated, Tomonaga's bombers possessed total control of the airspace above Midway Atoll. At 6:30 they began their bombing runs. We possess an incredibly rare, but a visceral primary source documenting the exact sensory experience of this bombardment. The legendary Hollywood film director John Ford was physically standing on the island that morning. The Navy had sent him to Midway to shoot a propaganda documentary. Ford did not hide in a concrete bunker. He climbed onto the roof of the island's powerhouse, clutching a heavy 16mm motion picture camera, and filmed the entire assault as high explosive bombs detonated around him. Ford's personal combat diary and the resulting raw footage strip away all the sterilized strategic glamour of warfare. He recorded the deafening, chest-compressing shockwaves of heavy ordnance ripping the coral island apart. He filmed massive columns of black, oily smoke erupting from the aviation fuel tanks. A Japanese bomb exploded close to his position, sending a jagged piece of steel shrapnel slicing directly into his left arm. Ford kept the camera rolling. He captured the terrifying sound of the Japanese Zeros making low-level strafing runs, their machine guns chewing up the sand and tearing into the hospital buildings. He documented the frantic, desperate efforts of the Marine anti-aircraft gunners firing back at the diving planes. The noise was absolute, a continuous physical assault on the eardrums. The Japanese strike force pounded the tiny atoll for exactly 20 minutes. They demolished the seaplane hangars, destroyed the fuel depot, and severely damaged the hospital and the powerhouse. The psychological impact on the defenders trapped on the ground was immense. They were isolated, bleeding, and entirely defenseless against the sky. The Japanese pilots rallied their squadrons and turned back toward their fleet, confident they had crippled the island's defences. Lieutenant Tominaga evaluated the burning wreckage below him. He analysed the damage through a purely tactical framework. He noted that despite the massive destruction of the buildings and fuel tanks, the actual airstrip, the long strip of crushed coral runway, remained largely intact. American bombers could still potentially launch from that runway to threaten the approaching Japanese invasion force. Tominaga engaged his radio transmitter. He sent a single, heavily coded message back to Admiral Nagumo standing on the Akagi. He reported that a second strike was absolutely required to completely neutralise the target. This specific radio transmission acts as the crucial pivot point of the entire battle. Analysed Tominaga's decision using basic critical thinking. He made a completely rational, mathematically sound recommendation based on the limited information he possessed. His objective was to secure the island for the amphibious landing. The runway was active, therefore the island was not secure. He had no idea that 3 American aircraft carriers were currently lurking just beyond the horizon, listening to his every word. Tominaga's highly logical request for a second strike travelled across the radio waves and landed directly on the bridge of the Japanese flagship. This single sentence instantly triggered a massive, cascading logistical failure that would paralyse the Japanese command structure. Admiral Nagumo was about to face a terrifying strategic dilemma, forced to make a split-second decision that would determine the survival of his fleet, the lives of thousands of his sailors, and the ultimate economic fate of the Japanese Empire. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi at 7:15 in the morning, holding the radio dispatch from Lieutenant Tominaga. The message explicitly demanded a second bombing strike to completely neutralise the Midway runway. Nagumo faced a brutal logistical reality. Down in the enclosed hangar decks of his 4 carriers, 93 reserve aircraft sat fully fueled and armed with heavy armour-piercing Type 91 torpedoes. Japanese naval doctrine strictly dictated keeping a massive reserve force ready to destroy any American warships that might suddenly appear. Nagumo looked at the empty ocean horizon. His scout planes had been flying for hours and reported absolutely nothing. Relying on this negative intelligence, Nagumo made a deeply rational, completely logical decision that would ultimately doom the Japanese Empire. He ordered his crews to strip the anti-ship torpedoes off the reserve planes and replace them with high-explosive land bombs for a second strike on the island. Execute a mental exercise in time-motion analysis to understand the sheer physical nightmare Nagumo just unleashed on his own men. Swapping the ordnance on 93 aircraft is not a matter of pushing a button. A Type 91 torpedo weighs over 1,800 pounds. A Type 80 land bomb weighs equally as much. The enclosed hangar deck of a 1940s aircraft carrier was a cramped and suffocating steel tunnel filled with highly volatile aviation fuel. The Japanese armourers had to manually lower the heavy torpedoes onto specialised steel carts using hand-cranked chain hoists. They had to push these massive carts across a rolling, vibrating deck, manoeuvre them down narrow elevators into the ship's magazines, haul up the land bombs, and winch them onto the aircraft. To translate this labour into a modern context, imagine ordering a team of mechanics to completely change the engines on 90 heavy semi-trucks simultaneously. Now force them to do it inside a dark, unventilated parking garage while a major earthquake shakes the building. The official Japanese timeline calculated this massive logistical operation would take a highly trained crew roughly 90 minutes of uninterrupted back-breaking labour. The armourers stripped down to their loincloths, sweating profusely, wrestling with tons of high explosives as the ships pitched in the ocean swells. Exactly 25 minutes into this exhausting process, at 7:40, the entire strategic foundation of the Japanese battle plan collapsed. A Japanese scout plane launched late from the heavy cruiser Tone due to a mechanical catapult failure suddenly broke radio silence. The pilot broadcasted a frantic message reporting 10 American surface ships sailing roughly 200 miles to the east. Nagumo froze. The impossible had just happened. An American fleet was operating squarely in his blind spot. Analyze Nagumo's decision matrix through the strict rules of game theory. He is caught in a fatal dilemma. He has half his aircraft returning from Midway, and desperately low on fuel and needing to land immediately. He has his reserve aircraft sitting in the hangars, currently halfway through being armed with the completely wrong weapons. Land bombs will shatter against the thick steel armour of an American warship. He needs torpedoes. At 8:20, the Tone Scout plane transmitted a second, terrifying update. The pilot reported that the American formation appeared to include an aircraft carrier. Nagumo immediately reversed his previous order. He shouted down to the hangar decks to stop loading the land bombs, take them off the planes, and put the heavy torpedoes back on. This oscillating command completely broke the Japanese logistical chain. The armourers down in the hangars were pushed beyond human endurance. They frantically reversed their mechanical processes. Under intense psychological pressure to arm the strike force immediately, the armourers abandoned strict naval safety protocols. They did not return the heavy land bombs to the heavily armoured underground magazines. They simply unbolted the 800-pound explosives and rolled them to the side of the hangar deck, leaving them sitting entirely exposed next to highly flammable fuel hoses. The Japanese carriers transformed into massive floating powder kegs waiting for a single spark. While Nagumo wrestled with this internal mechanical chaos, the external American threat violently materialized. At 9:20, the piercing scream of air raid sirens echoed across the Japanese fleet. Low on the horizon, hugging the tops of the ocean waves, a squadron of American aircraft charged directly toward the Kido Butai. This was Torpedo Squadron 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, launching from the aircraft carrier Hornet. Waldron was a fierce, uncompromising officer of Lakota Sioux heritage. He had openly defied his superior officer's navigation plan earlier that morning, correctly calculating that the Japanese fleet was moving along a different trajectory. Waldron led his 15 aircraft on a direct, unwavering line toward the enemy. The pilots of Torpedo Squadron 8 were flying the Douglas TBD Devastator. Calling this aircraft obsolete severely understates its mechanical vulnerability. The Devastator was tragically slow, lumbering heavily through the air at barely 100 miles per hour when carrying a full torpedo payload. The American pilots possessed no fighter escort. Due to severe communication failures and chaotic launch procedures back at the American fleet, the protective fighter squadrons had taken a different route and were completely lost in the clouds. Waldron and his men were entirely alone. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, consisting of over 50 Mitsubishi Zero fighters circling high above the fleet, spotted the incoming Devastators. The Zeros immediately rolled over and entered a steep, screaming dive. The ensuing engagement instantly devolved into an airborne execution. The American torpedo planes had to fly low, straight, and level for several miles to properly drop their unguided weapons. They became completely static targets. The lightweight Japanese fighters slashed through the American formation with terrifying speed, firing heavy 20mm explosive shells. The Devastators caught fire immediately. Wings snapped off. Entire fuselages disintegrated in midair, raining burning aluminum and human bodies into the freezing Pacific. We know the exact horrifying details of this massacre because of a single primary source. Ensign George Gay piloted one of the Devastators. According to his official declassified interrogation report, Gay watched every single aircraft in his squadron get blown out of the sky. His own plane was shredded by heavy machine gun fire, deeply wounding his left arm and leg. His rear gunner was killed instantly. Gay fought the burning controls, managed to drop his torpedo, which completely missed the carrier Akagi, and then violently crashed into the ocean. He managed to swim out of the sinking cockpit, clutching a black rubber seat cushion to hide his head from the strafing Japanese pilots. Bobbing in the salt water, bleeding and exhausted, George Gay became a front-row witness to the turning point of the entire Pacific War. He watched 15 American torpedo planes go in. He was the only man to survive. Torpedo Squadron 8 was completely wiped out. They scored absolutely 0 hits on the Japanese fleet. Traditional military analysis might classify Waldron's charge as a brave but ultimately useless failure. Naval strategists analysing the battle through a broader kinetic framework completely disagree. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8, followed rapidly by similar suicidal charges from the torpedo squadrons of the Enterprise and Yorktown, served a massive unintentional tactical purpose. The relentless, jaunt, low-level American attacks forced the Japanese aircraft carriers into desperate high-speed evasive manoeuvres. The massive ships carved sharp zigzags through the water, making it physically impossible for them to launch their own reserve strike force. More importantly, the American torpedo planes acted as a colossal, irresistible magnet. They dragged every single Japanese Zero fighter down from the high altitudes to defend the fleet at sea level. The Japanese pilots expended their ammunition and burned their fuel aggressively, hunting the slow devastators right above the waves. Ensign George Gay floated quietly in the water, surrounded by the churning wakes of the Japanese destroyers. He looked up at the sky. The combat air patrol was completely engaged at sea level. The clouds above the Japanese fleet were entirely empty. The intricate, interlocking defense matrix of the Kido-Butai had been pulled completely out of position. The massive steel flight decks of the carriers, packed tight with fully fueled planes and discarded high explosives, were entirely exposed to the open sky. A catastrophic mathematical equation had just been perfectly balanced, completely unnoticed by the victorious Japanese sailors celebrating the destruction of the torpedo planes. Floating helplessly in the oil-slicked water, Ensign George Gay watched the Japanese fleet maneuver with absolute impunity. The time was 10:20 on the morning of June 4th. The surviving Zero fighters of the Combat Air Patrol glided gracefully at low altitude, returning to their carriers to refuel and rearm after massacring the American torpedo squadrons. The massive steel flight decks of the Kido-Butai were completely intact. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had survived the desperate American torpedo assaults without suffering a single scratch on his warships. Down in the sweltering hangar decks, the exhausted Japanese armourers were finally finishing the chaotic process of arming the reserve strike force. The Japanese Empire stood exactly 5 minutes away from launching a devastating counterattack that would obliterate the United States Pacific Fleet. Look straight up into the sky from George Gay's perspective. The airspace directly above the Japanese fleet, normally fiercely guarded by layers of fighter patrols, was entirely empty. The torpedo planes had successfully dragged every single Japanese defender down to the surface of the ocean. 20,000 feet above this unprotected airspace, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey peered through the canopy of his SPD Dauntless dive bomber. He commanded the Enterprise Air Group, consisting of 32 dive bombers. For the past hour, McCluskey had been flying over a completely empty ocean. Based on the original navigational projections, the Japanese fleet should have been directly below him. He was burning through his aviation fuel at an alarming rate. He faced a critical command decision. He could turn back immediately, securing the survival of his highly trained pilots and their aircraft, or he could continue searching and risk running his entire squadron out of fuel over the open Pacific. McCluskey possessed a deeply analytical mind. He scanned the endless blue horizon and spotted a single, faint white streak cutting across the ocean surface far to the north. It was the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arashi. This specific vessel had been detached from the main fleet earlier to hunt down an American submarine, the USS Nautilus. Having failed to destroy the submarine, the Arashi was currently steaming at maximum speed to rejoin Admiral Nagumo's carriers. Apply basic critical thinking to McCluskey's observation. A destroyer operating alone in enemy waters travelling at maximum velocity is not patrolling, it is catching up. McCluskey banked his entire formation and followed the white arrow drawn on the ocean by the Arashi. This single mathematically logical deduction of course and speed brought the Enterprise dive bombers directly over the Kido-Butai at precisely 10:22 in the morning. Simultaneously, completely by sheer chronological coincidence, another squadron of dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, arrived over the Japanese fleet from the southeast. The Dauntless dive bombers possessed a severe mechanical advantage over traditional horizontal bombers. High-altitude level bombers, like the Army Air Force's B-17S that had attacked the Japanese fleet earlier that morning without scoring a single hit, drop their weapons based on complex mathematical calculations of speed, wind, and target trajectory. If the target ship turns, the bombs fall harmlessly into the water. A dive bomber operates on brutal direct physics. The pilot literally points the entire aircraft straight down at the target, using the plane itself as a massive aiming reticle. Executing a 70-degree dive from 20,000 feet accelerates an aircraft to terminal velocity, a speed that would normally tear the wings off the fuselage. To survive this plunge, the SBD Dauntless featured a brilliant engineering innovation: specialized perforated dive flaps trailing behind the wings. These heavily drilled steel plates open mechanically during the dive, creating massive aerodynamic drag. They slowed the aircraft to a steady 250 knots, allowing the pilot to hold the plane completely stable against the violent G-forces, while staring directly through his telescopic sight at the expanding deck of an enemy ship. McCluskey ordered the attack. The Dauntless bombers pitched forward, opened their perforated flaps, and plummeted toward the Japanese flagship Akagi and the massive carrier Kaga. Max Leslie's Yorktown squadron simultaneously initiated a screaming dive targeting the carrier Soryu. To understand the terrifying physics of what happened next, we rely on the detailed flight logs and after-action reports of Lieutenant Richard Best, one of McCluskey's squadron commanders. Best pushed his control stick forward and entered a near-vertical dive toward the Akagi. The sensory experience was agonizing. The severe change in atmospheric pressure crushed his eardrums, the cockpit filled with the blinding glare of the Pacific sun reflecting off the ocean. The Japanese lookouts on the ships finally heard the roaring engines of the diving planes and began screaming warnings. The anti-aircraft gunners desperately tried to elevate their heavy cannons, but the American planes were dropping too fast, were plunging straight down the mathematical center of the Japanese defensive cone. At exactly 1,500 feet above the flight deck, Richard Best pulled the manual release lever. A 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb detached from the belly of his Dauntless. Best immediately hauled back on his control stick, fighting intense gravitational forces that drained the blood from his brain, leveling out mere feet above the churning ocean. His bomb struck the Akagi precisely on the middle elevator. If you view naval warfare purely as a contest of explosive yields, a single 1,000-pound bomb should not sink a 30,000-ton flagship. The destruction of the Japanese fleet was not caused by American explosives. It was caused by the catastrophic logistical failure engineered by Admiral Nagumo exactly 1 hour earlier. The extensive metallurgical and structural analysis detailed in the definitive historical work Shattered Sword exposes the fatal thermodynamic chain reaction. When Richard Best's bomb smashed through the wooden flight deck of the Akagi, it penetrated deep into the enclosed upper hangar deck before detonating. That specific hangar deck was currently packed edge-to-edge with fully fueled B-5N bombers. More importantly, the deck was heavily littered with the massive Type 80 land bombs that the exhausted armourers had failed to return to the underground magazines. Furthermore, the Japanese aircraft carriers utilised an incredibly fragile system of aviation fuel distribution. Unprotected, pressurised fuel lines ran directly along the hangar bulkheads. Best's bomb acted as a primary detonator inside a massive enclosed steel pressure cooker. The initial blast instantly ruptured the pressurised fuel lines, vaporising thousands of gallons of high-octane aviation gas into a highly explosive mist. The shockwave then triggered sympathetic detonations among the discarded 800-pound land bombs and the torpedoes strapped to the parked aircraft. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. The Akagi did not just catch fire, the ship suffered a complete internal atmospheric combustion. The massive steel flight deck buckled violently upward. Sheets of white-hot flame shot horizontally out of the hangar deck ventilation shafts, instantly incinerating hundreds of mechanics and armourers. Simultaneously, Wade McCluskey's bombers struck the carrier cargo with at least 4 direct hits, triggering an identical, uncontrollable chain reaction among the fully armed planes in her hangars. Miles away, Max Leslie's squadron planted 3 1,000-pound bombs directly into the deck of the Soryu, ripping the ship apart from the inside out. The entire geopolitical balance of the 20th century shifted violently in exactly 300 seconds. Between 1022 and 1027, the Kido Butai ceased to exist as a functional military force. 3 majestic, irreplaceable pillars of the Japanese Empire were instantly transformed into burning, uncontrollable slaughterhouses. Ensign George Gay watched the inferno from his floating seat cushion. He later described seeing massive columns of thick black smoke rocketing thousands of feet into the sky, towering over the ocean like the funeral pyres of a dying civilization. Admiral Yamamoto's terrifying 6-month rampage across the Pacific Ocean, built on extreme logistical gambles and strict operational dogma, was mathematically and physically dismantled in the span of 5 minutes. The United States Navy had delivered a devastating blow. The battle was far from over. Out on the horizon, hidden from the burning carnage, the 4th Japanese aircraft carrier, the Hiryu, remained completely intact. Commanded by the fiercely aggressive Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the Hiryu was rapidly turning into the wind, her flight deck heavily packed with vengeful pilots preparing to strike back at the American fleet. The doctrine of the calculated risk was about to face its ultimate bloody test. The Pacific Ocean burned violently around 10:30 in the morning. 3 of Admiral Yamamoto's invincible aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Fiichi and Soryu, were reduced to floating, uncontrollable infernos in the span of exactly 5 minutes. You might assume the Japanese command structure completely collapsed in the face of this unprecedented disaster. You must look past the burning wreckage to the northern horizon. The 4th Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, remained entirely untouched by the American dive bombers. She had been sailing slightly ahead of the main formation, hidden beneath a dense cloud barrier. Standing on her bridge was Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, widely considered the most aggressive, tactically brilliant officer in the Japanese Imperial Navy. Yamaguchi looked out at the towering columns of black smoke rising from his sister ships. He fully understood the catastrophic mathematical reality of his situation. He was facing 3 fully operational American aircraft carriers with only 1. Basic military logic dictated an immediate retreat to preserve the Hiryu and her highly trained crew. Yamaguchi rejected logic. He operated under a strict psychological framework dictated by the samurai code of Bushido, which demanded immediate violent retaliation to restore the honour of the fleet. He ordered his flight deck crews to launch every available aircraft immediately. He intended to follow the retreating American dive bombers straight back to their source. 18 Japanese dive bombers and 6 escorting Zero fighters roared off the wooden deck of the Hiryu. They formed up and flew relentlessly toward the coordinate known as Point Luck. Waiting for them was the USS Yorktown. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the American task force from this heavily scarred vessel. The Yorktown was already a battered survivor, hastily patched together by civilian contractors at Pearl Harbor just days earlier. The radar operators deep inside the ship stared intently at their glowing oscilloscope screens. Shortly before noon, a bright green blip materialized. The Japanese strike force was approaching fast from 32 miles away. The American fleet immediately shifted into a defensive posture. The heavy cruisers and destroyers surrounding the Yorktown accelerated, churning the water white, forming a massive circular steel ring around the vulnerable carrier. The anti-aircraft gunners strapped themselves into their mounts, loading heavy explosive shells into the breaches. High above the fleet, the Combat Air Patrol, consisting of F-4F Wildcat fighters launched from the USS Enterprise and Hornet, intercepted the incoming Japanese squadron. The Wildcats tore into the Japanese formation, shooting down several bombers before they could even see the American ships. The surviving Japanese pilots pushed through the defensive screen with terrifying discipline. They entered their steep dives directly over the Yorktown. The American anti-aircraft fire was completely overwhelming, filling the sky with thick black bursts of flak. The Japanese pilots ignored the shrapnel shredding their wings. They released their weapons. 3 heavy armor-piercing bombs struck the Yorktown. The physical impact was devastating. One bomb ripped through the flight deck and exploded deep inside the ship's funnel, and instantly extinguishing the boiler fires and destroying the radar systems. A second bomb detonated inside the aviation ammunition magazine, but quick-thinking American engineers had already flooded the compartment with seawater, preventing a catastrophic secondary explosion. The third bomb tore through the starboard elevator. The massive ship immediately lost all propulsion, slowing to a dead stop in the middle of the ocean, bleeding thick black smoke into the sky. Yamaguchi's pilots returned to the Hiryu and reported that they had successfully neutralized an American carrier. They believed the Yorktown was dead. They failed to account for the astonishing industrial resilience and advanced logistical training of the United States Navy. The Japanese ships we saw destroyed earlier succumbed to uncontrollable fires because their damage control protocols were deeply flawed and overly centralized. American damage control operated on a completely different philosophy of decentralized survival. Every single sailor on the Yorktown, from the cooks to the mechanics, was highly trained in firefighting and structural repair. Read the official after-action report submitted by Captain Elliot Buckmaster, the commanding officer of the Yorktown. His incredibly detailed account reads like a manual on industrial crisis management. Down in the suffocating darkness of the flooded boiler rooms, engineers waded through chest-deep scalding water. They manually bypassed ruptured steam lines. They rerouted emergency electrical power using heavy cables dragged across the smoking decks. Within an hour, they had patched the boilers, extinguished the main fires, and restarted the engines. They even managed to raise a massive new battle flag. The Yorktown began moving again, steadily increasing her speed to 19 knots. This miraculous recovery engineered a bizarre and fatal psychological trap for the Japanese. Admiral Yamaguchi launched his second strike wave from the Hiryu, consisting of 10 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. When these pilots arrived over the American fleet a few hours later, they saw a fully operational aircraft carrier steaming rapidly through the water. They mathematically concluded that this could not possibly be the same ship they had bombed earlier. They assumed they had found the USS Enterprise or the Hornet. They aggressively attacked the Yorktown again. The American anti-aircraft fire was brutal, but 2 Japanese torpedoes slammed into the port side of the carrier. The concussive shockwave ripped open the massive steel hull beneath the waterline. Millions of gallons of ocean water flooded into the ship's lower compartments. The Yorktown immediately lost all power and took on a severe 26-degree list to the port side. The flight deck tilted at such an extreme angle that sailors could no longer stand upright. Captain Buckmaster analysed the massive structural failure. The ship was taking on water faster than the pumps could expel it. He ordered his crew to abandon ship. The evacuation was not a chaotic panic. It was a highly organised, systematic withdrawal, detailed meticulously in Buckmaster's report. Sailors lowered heavily wounded men down ropes into waiting life rafts. The surrounding destroyers moved in dangerously close to pull survivors from the oil-slicked water. The United States Navy lost a massive, highly valuable fleet carrier that afternoon. To understand the true outcome of the Battle of Midway, we must analyse this loss through the cold, unforgiving lens of war economics and human capital. Losing the Yorktown was a severe tactical blow. The economic reality, however, heavily favoured the Americans. The United States possessed a massive industrial infrastructure that was currently laying the steel keels for dozens of new Essex-class aircraft carriers. They could physically replace the Yorktown. Japan was about to lose something they could never replace. The Hiryu's desperate piecemeal attacks had depleted Yamaguchi's highly trained aviators. The Japanese Imperial Navy required years to train a single carrier pilot to the elite standard of the men who bombed Pearl Harbor. They selected only the absolute top tier of physical and mental candidates, submitting them to a brutal, lengthy training regimen. This created a small, incredibly lethal force of master aviators. The United States approached pilot training identically to how they approach building tanks in Detroit. They established massive, highly standardized training pipelines. They accepted thousands of young men, taught them the rigid fundamentals of flight, and mass-produced competent aviators at an astonishing industrial rate. Compare this to a modern technology corporation. Japan operated like a boutique tech firm that relied entirely on 20 irreplaceable senior developers. If those developers quit, the company collapses. The United States operated like a massive global tech giant with a streamlined training program, constantly pumping out thousands of junior developers who could immediately step in and write code. When the sun began to set on June 4th, Japan had lost 3 aircraft carriers, but more importantly, they had lost hundreds of veteran pilots and master mechanics to the infernos below deck and the anti-aircraft fire above. Admiral Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, watching his few surviving planes return. He had traded his most valuable, irreplaceable human capital to sink a single American ship. He did not know that the Enterprise and the Hornet were currently launching a massive combined strike force of dive bombers heading directly for his exact coordinates. The mathematics of the calculated risk were about to demand a final bloody payment. Late afternoon on June 4th brought no relief from the relentless mechanical violence. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu, surrounded by the vast, empty Pacific. He had successfully launched 2 desperate strikes against the American fleet, resulting in the crippling of the USS Yorktown. He believed he had evened the mathematical odds. He operated under the fatal assumption that his aviators had destroyed 2 separate American aircraft carriers. He calculated that only 1 American flat top remained functional. Yamaguchi ordered his exhausted flight deck crews to prepare a 3rd, massive strike wave to deliver the final killing blow at dusk. The Japanese mechanics worked furiously, hauling heavy torpedoes and aviation fuel across the wooden deck. They never got the chance to launch. High above the Hiryu, hidden in the glare of the late afternoon sun, a combined strike force of 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and Hornet entered their final attack vectors. Lieutenant W. Earl Gallagher led the American formation. He looked down and saw the Hiryu steaming at 30 knots, desperately turning into the wind to launch her fighters. The Japanese combat air patrol was severely depleted. Only a handful of Zero fighters remained airborne, and their pilots were physically exhausted, their aircraft running dangerously low on ammunition and fuel. The American dive bombers pushed over into their vertical plunges entirely unopposed by the sky. The physics of destruction repeated themselves with terrifying precision. 4 1,000-pound armour-piercing bombs smashed completely through the forward flight deck of the Hiryu. The explosions ripped into the enclosed hangar deck, instantly igniting the fully fueled aircraft parked inside. The forward elevator was blown entirely out of its shaft, violently hurled against the ship's island superstructure like a massive piece of steel shrapnel. The Hiryu immediately lost steering control, transforming into a runaway blazing torch moving at high speed across the ocean. This catastrophic strike finalized the absolute annihilation of the Kido Butai. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, stationed hundreds of miles to the rear aboard the super battleship Yamato, received the fractured, frantic radio transmissions reporting the destruction of his 4th and final aircraft carrier. Examine Yamamoto's reaction through the strict parameters of military game theory. A lesser commander would have immediately ordered a general retreat to preserve his remaining forces. Yamamoto commanded the most powerful surface fleet on the planet. He possessed massive battleships armed with 14 and 18-inch guns, heavy cruisers, and a swarm of highly lethal destroyers. He had lost his air cover, but he still held overwhelming superiority in heavy naval artillery. Yamamoto decided to change the fundamental rules of the engagement. He ordered his massive surface fleet to accelerate to maximum speed and charge directly east, toward the last known coordinates of the American fleet, or he intended to force a catastrophic night surface action. You must understand the highly specialized nature of Japanese night combat doctrine to grasp the lethal threat this maneuver posed. The Imperial Japanese Navy trained obsessively for fighting in complete darkness. They possessed highly advanced optical technology, outfitting their lookouts with massive specialized binoculars designed to gather ambient starlight. More importantly, their cruisers and destroyers carried the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo. This weapon was an absolute mechanical nightmare for the Allies. It was propelled by compressed oxygen, leaving almost no visible wake, carried a massive explosive warhead, and possessed a range far exceeding any American torpedo. Deus Yamamoto was essentially trying to drag an American sniper into a pitch-black alleyway for a brutal knife fight. If he could locate the Enterprise and Hornet in the dark, his battleships and cruisers would tear the lightly armoured American carriers to shreds in minutes. The American aircraft were essentially useless at night in 1942. Landing a fast-moving dive bomber on a pitching, unlit carrier deck in complete darkness was practically suicidal. Yamamoto bet the entire survival of his empire on this single, aggressive nighttime ambush. He needed the American commander to play his game. He needed Admiral Raymond Spruance to blindly sail west, chasing the retreating Japanese auxiliary ships directly into the jaws of his heavy battleships. Then Admiral Spruance stood on the flag bridge of the USS Enterprise as the sun disappeared below the horizon. He evaluated the tactical board with mechanical, emotionless precision. His own pilots were currently returning from the strike on the Hiryu. They were landing in the dark, out of fuel, crashing onto the deck in a state of absolute physical collapse. Spruance knew he had sunk 4 Japanese carriers. He also knew his own fleet was battered, his aviators were exhausted, and he possessed absolutely no heavy battleships to protect his carriers in a surface gunfight. Spruance strictly applied the doctrine of the calculated risk ordered by Admiral Nimitz days earlier. He analysed the immense, irreplaceable economic value of the Enterprise and the Hornet. He recognised that pushing his fleet westward into the darkness offered zero strategic benefit and carried an astronomically high risk of total annihilation. Spruance gave a simple, highly disciplined order that saved the United States Navy. He ordered his task force to turn east, actively sailing away from the enemy, opening the distance between his vulnerable carriers and the approaching Japanese heavy guns. To translate this command decision into a modern context, imagine a high-stakes gambler sitting at a casino table. He has just won the largest jackpot in history. The casino manager approaches, offering him a chance to double his winnings on a single blind roll of the dice in a dark room. An emotional, ego-driven player takes the bet. A highly analytical, disciplined player cashes out his chips and walks out the front door. Spruance cashed out the United States Navy. He refused to give Yamamoto the apocalyptic night battle he so desperately needed. Yamamoto's heavy cruisers sprinted eastward through the dark, their lookouts straining through their massive binoculars, finding absolutely nothing but empty ocean. By dawn on June 5th, Yamamoto finally accepted the mathematical reality of his defeat. The Americans had successfully broken contact. He could not protect his slow-moving invasion transports from American air attacks during the daylight. He issued the most agonizing order of his military career. He officially cancelled Operation Emma and ordered his entire massive armada to turn around and retreat toward the home islands. Before the Japanese fleet withdrew, a deeply tragic and highly symbolic event occurred aboard the burning wreckage of the Hiryu. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi refused to abandon his ship. We possess the exact details of his final moments from the surviving crew members. Yamaguchi summoned his senior staff to the flight deck. He delivered a brief address, taking absolute personal responsibility for the loss of the carrier. He then drank a small ceremonial cup of water with the ship's captain, Tomeo Kaku. Yamaguchi ordered the rest of the crew to evacuate immediately. He and Captain Kaku calmly tied themselves to the binnacle on the ship's compass bridge. They chose to go down with the vessel, adhering strictly to the ancient samurai tradition. A Japanese destroyer fired a spread of torpedoes into the burning hull of the Hiryu to scuttle her, sending the ship and her commander to the bottom of the Pacific. The death of Admiral Yamaguchi represented a catastrophic loss of human capital for the Japanese Empire. He was widely considered the most capable tactical officer in the fleet, the logical successor to Yamamoto himself. Japan could replace the steel hull of the Hiryu, but they could never replicate the aggressive brilliance and decades of experience locked inside Yamaguchi's mind. The morning sun of June 5th illuminated a fundamentally altered geopolitical landscape. The Battle of Midway triggered an immediate, irreversible World War II Pacific Theatre strategy shift. The Japanese Empire permanently lost the strategic initiative. They would never again launch a major offensive sweep across the ocean. Their massive, heavily armed military machine was forced entirely onto the defensive, retreating behind a shrinking perimeter of island fortresses. The United States Navy, despite taking heavy casualties and losing the Yorktown, had mathematically decapitated the enemy's offensive capability. The sprawling, terrifying Japanese logistical network, stretched over thousands of miles of hostile water, finally snapped. The bleeding giant of American industrial power had been given the exact amount of time it needed to fully awaken, promising a tidal wave of newly forged steel that would eventually drown the empire of the rising sun. The physical debris of the Kido Butai sank thousands of fathoms down to the freezing floor of the Pacific Ocean. 30 hours after the final bomb detonated, Ensign George Gay heard the droning engines of a PBY Catalina flying boat. The young pilot, he's severely wounded and suffering from extreme dehydration, waved his black rubber seat cushion frantically at the sky. The massive amphibious aircraft landed on the open ocean swells and pulled him to safety. Gay had survived a mathematical impossibility. He had personally witnessed the exact moment the geopolitical trajectory of the 20th century reversed course. He spent the next several months recovering in a naval hospital, eventually returning to combat duty. Thousands of miles to the west, the surviving remnants of Admiral Yamamoto's shattered armada limped back toward the Japanese home islands. The officers aboard the battleship Yamato faced a terrifying psychological crisis. They had lost 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers, hundreds of elite aviators, and the absolute myth of their own invincibility. While Admiral Yamamoto understood the grim economic math waiting for his nation, he also recognised the devastating impact this news would have on the morale of the Japanese civilian population. The Japanese High Command made a deeply fatal, calculated decision regarding information control. They chose absolute deception. When the heavily damaged cruisers and surviving transports finally docked at naval bases like Kure and Yokosuka, the military police immediately surrounded the arriving ships. They did not welcome the returning sailors as heroes. They treated them like dangerous political dissidents. Declassified medical logs and post-war testimonies reveal a chilling protocol of forced isolation. Heavily wounded mechanics and burned flight deck crews were violently separated from their families. The military transferred them under the cover of darkness to highly restricted, heavily guarded wards within the Yokosuka Naval Hospital. Doctors and nurses were explicitly threatened with severe punishment if they discussed the patient's injuries with anyone in the outside world. The Japanese government officially broadcasted a massive propaganda victory over the national radio networks, claiming they had severely crippled the American fleet and secured the Midway region. Analyze this decision through the lens of organisational psychology. The Japanese leadership actively began lying to their own logistical planners and industrial sector. By hiding the catastrophic loss of the 4 aircraft carriers, they simultaneously hid the desperate immediate need to replace those ships. Shipyard managers continued operating under peacetime production schedules, completely unaware that their primary defensive shield had just been completely vaporized. A military command structure that isolates itself from the brutal truth of its own failures inevitably guarantees its own destruction. We must examine the final, absolute cause of the Japanese Empire's collapse through the cold, unforgiving data published in the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. This massive post-war economic analysis compiled by civilian economists strips away the romanticism of battlefield tactics. It exposes the raw industrial disparity between the two warring nations. The Battle of Midway brought the United States exactly what Admiral Nimitz needed: time. Nimitz's calculated risk successfully neutralized the Japanese offensive momentum, providing the American industrial sector a 12-month breathing period to completely overhaul its manufacturing base. The transformation was unprecedented in human history. Read the raw production numbers from the survey. Between 1942 and 1945, the Japanese Empire managed to launch exactly 6 new fleet aircraft carriers. They struggled desperately to secure raw steel, suffering from a severe shortage of skilled welders and heavy construction machinery. During that exact same time period, the United States launched 24 massive Essex-class fleet carriers, along with over 100 smaller escort carriers. American shipyards in places like Brooklyn, Philadelphia, and Newport News operated 24 hours a day, utilizing revolutionary modular welding techniques. And they were launching a new heavily armored warship every single week. To understand this industrial disparity in a modern context, Imagine a brutal economic war between two technology hardware companies. The Japanese Empire operated like a boutique manufacturing firm. They built exquisite, highly specialized products using master artisans, but they possessed a fragile, severely limited supply chain. When their primary factory burned down, they lacked the capital and the resources to rebuild it. The United States operated like the combined modern manufacturing networks of Amazon, Apple, and Foxconn. They possessed infinite raw materials, highly standardized production lines, and an automated logistics network that could absorb massive physical losses without slowing down. The destruction of the USS Yorktown was a mere accounting error for the American industrial machine. The destruction of the Kido Butai completely bankrupted the Japanese military. Furthermore, Japan permanently lost its most valuable human capital. The aviators who died at Midway were veterans of the war in China and the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had spent thousands of hours mastering the highly volatile Mitsubishi Zero. The Japanese military training pipeline was incredibly narrow and rigidly elitist. They completely failed to adapt their training doctrines to replace these mass casualties. They sent half-trained, inexperienced boys into the skies during the later years of the war. These young pilots were subsequently massacred by highly disciplined, mass-produced American aviators flying vastly superior, yet heavily armoured aircraft like the F-6F Hellcat. The battle fought across the empty ocean around Midway Atoll was never truly about capturing a tiny sandy outpost. It was the ultimate violent collision between a rigid, deeply arrogant military hierarchy and a highly adaptable, economically dominant industrial superpower. Admiral Yamamoto's complex, fuel-hungry, and aggressively separated fleet movements violated fundamental rules of logistics and risk management. Admiral Nimitz's reliance on intercepted intelligence, decentralized damage control, and strict mathematical pragmatism secured the survival of the free world. The victory at Midway was fundamentally built by the exhausted codebreakers freezing in a Hawaiian basement, the shipyard workers sweating in a dry dock to patch a dying carrier, and the young dive bomber pilots who plunged straight down into the mathematical centre of an enemy fleet. They collectively turned the immense gears of history, ensuring that the rising sun of the Japanese Empire would ultimately set in absolute ruin. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the true logistical and economic engines that drove the Battle of Midway. If you found this analysis of war economics and tactical history valuable, please hit the like button and make sure you subscribe to the channel. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Do you think Admiral Yamamoto could have won the battle if he had broken radio silence and warned his frontline carriers about the American ambush? Or was the Japanese fleet mathematically doomed by their fragile supply lines regardless of his tactical decisions? Let me know your perspective, and I will see you in the next documentary.